So you have been invited to play Dungeons and Dragons. Awesome. But you have no idea how to play or even really what that is. Well, maybe you were sent this video by the person who invited you to play, and I'm here to help. Or maybe you went online and saw this Dungeons and Dragons thing being played in a YouTube video, or maybe you found some books in the store, but either way, you think this thing looks interesting, fun, exciting. You want to play. Well, again, I'm here to help. And to play Dungeons and Dragons, you basically need 5 things. To play Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to need friends. Well, I guess they don't have to be friends. You need people, but they're people that you're going to spend 3 or 4 hours with on probably more than one occasion. So let's call them friends. So one of your friends will need to be the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is kind of the narrator, curator. They're the guide that describes the world, describes the scenes within that world. And the rest of you decide how you are going to interact with those scenes that the DM describes. So the rest of you are the players. So that's the second thing you need. The first thing you need is the DM. The second thing you need is players. As a player, it's your job to interact with the scene that the DM describes. So when the DM describes the scene of you're exploring the forest in search of the sinister sorcerer, you then decide what you are going to do in that scene. Now, to help you decide what to do, each player has a character, and that's the third thing on our list. You need characters. So the character gives you an idea of what you can do in that role, in that setting. So that's why we call it role playing. You play the character in this story that you are creating together with your DM and the other players. So the character can have a number of different archetypes. Just a few examples of the many archetypes you can play in Dungeons and Dragons are the fighter, someone who's good with weapons and wearing armor, the wizard, who's casts spells and wields magic, the rogue, who is sneaky and cunning, the ranger, who is good at tracking and finding things. These are just some of the archetypes that are available for you as your character. The fourth thing you are going to need is rules. And rules are what makes the difference between a role-playing game and just playing make-believe. The rules establish guidelines and parameters so that you know that your fighter can do this type of attack, or your rogue is good at sneaking up on people, or the ranger has a particular skill at finding tracks in the woods. These rules help you determine your success and failure in the scenes that your DM is describing. Now, the fifth thing you're going to need is a 20-sided dice. Now, this one is extra. I got it for the camera. It's about 3 times the size of a D20 that you're probably going to use. So I called it a D20 because that's the abbreviation. Just like DM is the abbreviation for Dungeon Master, D20 is the abbreviation for a 20-sided die. There are other types of dice too, but we'll get to those later. But this is the primary way that you determine your success or failure in the story. So the DM describes the situation, you decide on what your character is going to do, and then you roll the D20 to determine the result. And then that result becomes another description as the DM describes what happens as a result of your action. And that brings us to the other key component of Dungeons and Dragons, and that's the game loop. So for example, the DM describes how you're searching the forest for the sinister sorcerer and the missing unicorns. You decide that you're going to climb a tree to get a better vantage point. The DM tells you to roll the dice to determine how high you can climb the tree. Once you determine that success, the Dungeon Master describes what you see from that new vantage point. The Dungeon Master describes in the distance, you can see a clearing in the forest and an old grotto, a hole carved out of a rugged hillside that has what looks like a small temple or large shrine in that grotto. So armed with that information, you decide to climb down the tree. The DM determines that's easy to do, you don't have to roll the dice, and looks at the rest of the players to see what they want to do next. So the DM has already described the scene, and the ranger decides to look for tracks. He's going to look for evidence of the sinister sorcerer and the missing unicorns to see if maybe they had gone in the direction of that grotto. And the ranger rolls the dice, and the DM determines that he is successful and he found tracks that lead him to that clearing and the grotto. This is the most amazing thing about role-playing games. This is what makes role-playing games and Dungeons & Dragons so much fun. This is not a video game that has limitations on it, that you can only go so far. The world's only made so big in a video game. In a role-playing game, since you have a real-life dungeon master making these descriptions and building this world, and you are collaborating together to make these decisions and these determinations, you are all working together and building a world that's far bigger, far more interesting, and has far more options than any video game ever could. And that's the amazing thing about Dungeons & Dragons. So let's finish this video up with a quick look at our story and what our rogue, our ranger, our fighter, and our wizard are going to do next. The DM describes that you have arrived outside the sinister sorcerer's grotto. You, playing the rogue, decide to sneak into the grotto and spy on the sinister sorcerer. You roll the dice to determine your actions. You succeed and sneak forward. Then the DM describes what you see. The sinister sorcerer has multiple unicorns held captive, and he stands performing an ancient magic ritual before a statue with 12 arms. He's stealing the horns off of these unicorns for some nefarious purpose, to be sure. You also notice a strange amulet atop a pedestal. You believe this amulet to be instrumental to the sorcerer's ritual. You decide to sneak back to your friends and report what you have seen. You roll the dice to determine the outcome, and oh no, that's not a good roll. The DM describes that you've not done nearly as good a job sneaking out as you did sneaking in. But thankfully, you're not playing this game alone. Your friend, playing the fighter, gets to take a turn. With his turn, he decides to create a distraction to help you get back to the group unnoticed. He rolls the dice and rolls well. The DM determines he succeeds. Then the DM describes the following scene. As the fighter howls into his boot, it works. It distracts the sorcerer and interrupts his magic ritual. Then the sorcerer turns to his pack of wolf minions and orders them to investigate. That's when your other friend, the ranger, gets his turn, and he decides to shoot a spell from his bow. With the roll of the dice, the DM determines the ranger is successful. The DM describes the attack and how 2 of the wolves flee from the magic spell. But then he describes how 3 of the wolves surround your other friend, the wizard. But it's the wizard's turn, and they decide to cast an illusion of food to hopefully distract some of the remaining wolves. The DM determines the spell works and describes how the wolves are distracted by the illusion. But it's your turn. Now you decide to attack the remaining wolves. You roll the dice and determine it's a success. The DM describes your successful attack, but then reminds the group that the sinister sorcerer is still tormenting the unicorns. Now it's the fighter's turn, and you suggest a plan. The fighter will use his turn to protect the ranger, and the ranger will steal the sorcerer's amulet. The group decides to do it. The DM determines the fighter's dodge works and describes how the wolf misses their attack. This allows the ranger to take his turn free from the wolves' attack. The dice determine that the ranger succeeds, and the DM describes how the ranger shatters the magic amulet. But as it shatters, the dark magic from the amulet is released, an evil spirit. This demon is the consequence of the sorcerer's sinister magic. The old sorcerer and the demon engage in battle. The demon attacks. The sorcerer flings his magical bolts, and the demon returns in kind. Back and forth they contend as everyone takes cover. But now it's your wizard's friend's turn, and they decide to use their mage hand spell to gather up all the unicorn horns. The DM determines that works and describes how the wizard gathers up all the horns with their magic. It's your turn now, and you decide to lead everyone to safety. The DM and the rest of your friends determine that this is the best course of action, and everyone makes a run for it. The DM not only describes your escape, but describes how the demon and the sorcerer battle each other to the point that it brings the grotto's walls down upon them, destroying themselves beneath the falling rubble, and the evil shrine crumbles before you. So now you understand the basics of Dungeons & Dragons. You have your 5 essential things: the dungeon master, the players, the characters, the rules, and the dice. And once you have those 5 things, you use the game loop to play the game. Now subscribe and stay tuned, because my next video is going to go over the character sheet. Now, the character sheet is the tool that you use to connect your character to the rules, to the game world. The character sheet has a lot of components to it, and we're going to break those down in a series of videos that'll help you fully understand how to play this game. But for now, you have enough of the basics that I feel like you could show up at a game with a good dungeon master who will guide you through it, and you will be able to play Dungeons and Dragons.